Have you ever noticed that some people live the exact same life for 10 or 20 years straight? Same city, same habits, same circle, same job they complain about every day, same relationship that already stopped making them happy years ago. And the crazy part is, opportunities actually showed up in their life before. They had chances to move, chances to start over, chances to leave toxic people behind, chances to try something bigger. But every single time, they said the same thing. I don't know, I'm just used to this. And honestly, that sentence sounds harmless at first. But if you really think about it, I'm used to it has probably destroyed more potential than failure ever did. Because most people are not trapped by reality. They're trapped by familiarity. That's the real problem. A lot of people think they want a new life, but deep down, they only want a better version of their current comfort zone. They want more money without changing environments. They want growth without discomfort. They want success without uncertainty. But life doesn't work like that. Every major upgrade in life usually begins with losing something first. You lose comfort. You lose certainty. You lose the old version of yourself. And most people can't handle that feeling. That's why they stay stuck. You know what's interesting? Human beings can adapt to almost anything, even unhappiness, even emotional exhaustion, even living far below their potential. If somebody stays in a bad environment long enough, eventually it starts feeling normal. That's why some people stay in small environments their entire life, even when they know there's nothing left for them there. No growth, no opportunities, no inspiring people, no future. But it feels familiar, and familiar feels safe. That's the trap. A person can hate their life and still refuse to change it just because uncertainty scares them more than suffering. Think about how many people stay at jobs they hate for years. Every morning they wake up tired. Every Sunday night they feel depressed. They complain constantly. They know they're underpaid, overworked, and mentally drained. But the second you ask them why they don't leave, they immediately start listing fears. What if the next job is worse? What if I fail? What if I regret it? What if I can't survive? So they stay. Not because they're happy, because predictable pain feels safer than unpredictable change. And this doesn't just happen with work. It happens with relationships too. Some people know their relationship has been dead for years. There's no real connection anymore. No growth, no peace, no emotional support. They're constantly drained, constantly anxious, constantly pretending everything is okay. But they still can't let go. Why? Because they got attached to the history, to the memories, to the routine, to the idea of the person. Sometimes people don't miss the relationship, they miss familiarity. That's why letting go feels so difficult. You're not just leaving a person, a job, or a city. You're leaving an identity you became emotionally attached to. And a lot of people would rather suffer in a familiar environment than rebuild themselves in a new one. That's why real change is rare. Because changing your life is not just about gaining something new. It's about being willing to release what no longer fits you. And honestly, most people never develop that ability. Especially people who grew up in survival mode. When somebody spends years struggling financially or emotionally, they naturally become attached to stability, even if that stability is limiting them. That's why some people hold on to everything. Old clothes, broken furniture, expired relationships, outdated beliefs, dead dreams. They convince themselves they're being loyal, humble, or sentimental. But sometimes they're just afraid. Afraid to move forward. Afraid to evolve. Afraid to become someone different. Because becoming someone different requires entering unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory forces you to grow.
That's why some people never leave their hometown, even when they know there's a bigger world outside. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with small towns or simple living. This isn't about disrespecting where people come from. The problem is when a place no longer helps you grow, but you stay there anyway because it's emotionally comfortable. That's when comfort becomes dangerous. A lot of people secretly know their environment is shrinking them. They know the people around them think small. They know the conversations are repetitive. They know nobody around them is evolving. But instead of leaving, they adjust themselves downward to fit the environment. That happens all the time. A person with ambition enters a low-energy environment, and eventually their ambition starts disappearing too. Because environments affect people more than people realize. The people around you affect your standards, your mindset, your confidence, your habits, even your sense of possibility. If everybody around you thinks small, eventually dreaming big starts feeling unrealistic. That's why changing environments can completely change somebody's life. Sometimes the biggest breakthrough doesn't come from motivation. It comes from exposure. Exposure to different people, different lifestyles, different ways of thinking, different standards. That's why some people completely transform after moving to a new city. Not because the city magically changed them, but because their old environment stopped limiting them. For the first time, they met people who thought bigger, moved faster, took risks, built things, made money differently, saw life differently. And suddenly their old mindset no longer felt normal. That's powerful. But most people never experience that transformation because they never leave the environment that keeps reinforcing the old version of themselves. And honestly, that's one of the saddest things in life. Watching somebody stay loyal to a version of themselves they already outgrew. Because deep down, they're scared that if they let go of the old life, they might fail while building the new one. But here's the truth nobody wants to hear. You cannot become a new person while protecting your old comfort zone at the same time. At some point, something has to go. Old habits, old environments, old relationships, old identities. Growth always asks for an exchange. And the people who change their lives are usually not the smartest people in the room. They're simply the people most willing to let go.
A lot of people think being sentimental is a good thing. They think holding on to everything means they're loyal, emotional, deep, genuine. But sometimes, being unable to let go is exactly what keeps a person stuck in life. And the scary part is, most people don't even realize it's happening. Because attachment rarely looks dangerous in the beginning. It looks innocent. Keeping old things, staying connected to old people, revisiting old memories, refusing to throw things away. At first, it feels emotional. But over time, it quietly becomes a prison. You can actually learn a lot about somebody just by looking at what they refuse to let go of. Some people hold on to clothes they haven't worn in 10 years. Some people keep messages from people who destroyed them emotionally. Some people stay emotionally attached to versions of life that already ended a long time ago. And eventually, their entire identity becomes built around the past. That's dangerous. Because life only moves in one direction, forward. And if your mind keeps living in old energy, old memories, and old emotional patterns, your future slowly starts shrinking. A lot of people don't understand this, but everything around you affects your mental state. Your room affects you. Your environment affects you. The people around you affect you. Even the objects you constantly interact with affect your energy and emotions more than you realize. That's why sometimes you walk into somebody's house and immediately feel heaviness. Not because the house is ugly, but because everything inside feels emotionally stuck. Nothing changed for years. Same furniture, same routines, same mindset, same emotional atmosphere. It almost feels like time stopped moving there. And honestly, the same thing can happen to a person internally. When somebody refuses to update their life, eventually their energy becomes stagnant too. That's why some people slowly lose their excitement for life without even noticing it. They stop exploring, stop trying, stop risking, stop evolving. They become emotionally attached to predictability. And predictability slowly kills growth. You know what's interesting? A lot of people say they want a better future, but their daily behavior says the opposite. Because wanting a new life means being willing to release parts of the old one. And most people don't want to do that. They want change without sacrifice. But every major transformation requires separation. You separate from old habits, old environments, old identities, sometimes even old relationships. That's why growth feels painful. You're not just building something new, you're grieving something old at the same time. And honestly, that's where most people fail. Not because they're weak, but because emotionally, they keep trying to carry their old life into the next chapter. That never works. Imagine trying to run forward while dragging 10 heavy suitcases behind you. That's exactly how emotional attachment works. Some people are still emotionally controlled by things that happened 5 or 10 years ago. An old breakup, an old failure, an old version of themselves, an old environment. And because they never truly released it, they never fully moved forward either. That's why some people physically grow older, but mentally stay in the same place forever. They keep replaying old emotions instead of creating new experiences. And eventually, their entire life becomes built around comfort and memory instead of growth and possibility. You see this a lot with people who are terrified of changing environments. They'll stay in the same city forever, even when they know there's nothing left for them there. And when you ask why, they usually say things like, "My friends are here, my family is here, I grew up here, I'm attached to this place." Now, again, there's nothing wrong with loving where you come from. But there's a huge difference between love and attachment. Love gives you peace. Attachment controls you. That's the difference. If something prevents your growth, destroys your confidence, limits your opportunities, or keeps you emotionally small, but you still can't leave it behind, that's no longer love. That's fear, disguised as loyalty. And honestly, fear is one of the biggest reasons people stay trapped in average lives. Because average lives are usually very predictable. You already know the people. You already know the routines. You already know the limits. Nothing surprises you anymore. And strangely, a lot of people prefer predictable misery over uncertain opportunity. That's why some people never discover what they're truly capable of. They never test themselves in a new environment. Never challenge their identity. Never rebuild themselves. They spend their entire life protecting comfort instead of expanding possibility. And eventually, they wake up one day wondering why life feels so empty. But deep down, the answer is simple. Nothing changed because they never changed. The people who grow the fastest in life usually have one thing in common. They know when to release things. Not because they're cold-hearted, not because they don't feel emotions, but because they understand something most people don't. Everything has a season. Some environments are only meant for one chapter of your life. Some people are only meant to teach you lessons. Some versions of yourself are only temporary. And maturity is realizing that not everything is supposed to stay forever. That realization changes everything. Because once you stop worshiping the past, you finally create room for the future. You stop making decisions based on fear and memory. And you start making decisions based on growth. That's powerful. A lot of people think confidence comes from motivation. It doesn't. Real confidence comes from proving to yourself that you can survive change, that you can leave, that you can rebuild, that you can adapt, that your future
matters more than your attachment to familiarity. And honestly, one of the biggest signs somebody is evolving is this. They stop asking, what am I going to lose? And they start asking, what is this costing my future if I keep holding on to it?
One of the hardest truths to accept in life is this. Your environment shapes you more than your talent does. A lot of people don't want to hear that because it sounds unfair. They want to believe success is only about hard work, discipline, or intelligence. But reality is different. Who you spend time with matters. Where you live matters. What you see every day matters. The energy around you matters. Even your standards are heavily influenced by your environment. That's why two people with similar potential can end up living completely different lives. One person grows fast. The other stays stuck for years. And sometimes the difference isn't talent. It's exposure. You can't think beyond what you constantly see. If everybody around you thinks small, eventually dreaming big starts feeling unrealistic. If everybody around you is afraid to take risks, eventually you start becoming afraid too. If everybody around you settles for survival instead of growth, eventually you start believing survival is enough. That's how environments quietly shape people. Not overnight, but slowly. And honestly, this is exactly why some people feel exhausted all the time without understanding why. They're living in environments that drain ambition. Think about it. Some places normalize struggle so much that people stop trying to escape it. Being broke becomes normal. Being emotionally unhappy becomes normal. Being stuck becomes normal. And when something becomes normal long enough, people stop questioning it. That's dangerous. Because human beings naturally adapt to whatever environment they spend the most time in. If you spend enough time around negativity, your thinking becomes negative too. If you spend enough time around lazy people, discipline starts feeling extreme. If you spend enough time around people with no vision, eventually your own vision shrinks. That's why environment is so powerful. Most people underestimate how much their surroundings affect their psychology. Even simple things matter more than people realize. The conversations around you, the expectations around you, the lifestyle around you. All of it slowly programs your mind. That's why some people completely transform after moving to a different city. Suddenly, they're surrounded by people moving faster, thinking bigger, building businesses, chasing opportunities, improving themselves. And for the first time in their life, growth becomes normal. That changes everything. Because people rise or shrink based on what their environment rewards. If your environment rewards mediocrity, ambition starts feeling uncomfortable. But if your environment rewards growth, effort, and evolution, you naturally start leveling up too. That's why staying in the wrong place for too long can quietly destroy somebody's future. Not because the place itself is evil, but because staying there too long limits exposure. And limited exposure creates limited thinking. You see this happen all the time with people who never leave their hometown. Again, there's nothing wrong with hometowns. The problem is when somebody stays somewhere purely because they're emotionally attached to familiarity, even though deep down they know they stopped growing there years ago. Some people are physically adults, but mentally still trapped inside the mindset of the environment they grew up in. They still think small, still fear judgment, still fear failure, still fear trying something different. Because everybody around them thinks the same way. That's why breaking out of an environment can feel almost illegal emotionally. Sometimes the people closest to you unconsciously punish growth. The moment you think bigger, they call you unrealistic. The moment you want more, they call you greedy. The moment you try to evolve, they say, you've changed. And honestly, you should change. That's the whole point of growth. A person who never changes usually never grows either. But a lot of people stay small because they're terrified of leaving the emotional safety of the group. They would rather stay accepted than become successful. That's one of the biggest traps in life. Because sometimes your environment only loves the version of you that stays predictable. The version that doesn't outgrow them. The version that doesn't challenge the system. And the moment you start evolving, suddenly people get uncomfortable. Not because you're doing something wrong,
but because your growth reminds them of their own fear. That's why upgrading your life often requires distance. Distance from old thinking. Distance from limiting environments. Distance from people who normalize staying stuck. And honestly, this is where a lot of people fail. They want a new future while staying emotionally loyal to the environment that created their old limitations. That's impossible. You cannot heal in the same environment that keeps damaging you. You cannot think bigger while staying surrounded by people who fear ambition. You cannot become a different person while repeating the same routines every day. At some point, something has to change. And sometimes the change is physical. A new city, a new job, a new circle. But sometimes the biggest shift is internal. You stop needing permission from people who never understood your vision in the first place. That's powerful. Because once somebody changes their environment, they often realize something shocking. The limits they believed were reality were actually just local beliefs. That's it. There are places where dreaming big is considered arrogant. And there are places where dreaming big is considered normal. There are environments where building something meaningful sounds impossible. And there are environments where people do it every single day. That's why exposure matters so much. Sometimes one new environment can completely change your standards for life. And once your standards change, your decisions change too. You stop tolerating certain people, certain habits, certain lifestyles, certain excuses. Because now you've seen more. And once a person truly sees more, it becomes impossible to comfortably return to mental smallness. That's why some people completely transform after leaving the place they were emotionally attached to for years. Not because they suddenly became smarter, but because for the first time in their life, they finally entered an environment that matched their future instead of their past.
If you really pay attention to people who grow fast in life, you'll notice something interesting. They usually aren't the most comfortable people. They're the people most willing to change, most willing to leave, most willing to rebuild, most willing to start over. And honestly, that's one of the biggest differences between people who level up and people who stay stuck for decades. The people who stay stuck usually worship stability. The people who grow understand replacement. They understand that every new level in life demands a new version of you. And that new version cannot be built while you're desperately holding on to everything from the past. That's why the most successful people are often surprisingly good at letting go. Not because they don't care, but because they value growth more than emotional attachment. That's a huge difference. Most people make decisions emotionally. Growth-oriented people make decisions based on long-term value. That's why they can walk away from situations faster than others. A dead-end job, a draining relationship, a limiting environment, an outdated identity. The average person stays emotionally attached for years. But people with strong growth instincts notice something early. If I stay here too long, this situation will slowly destroy my future. And once they realize that, they move fast. That ability is powerful because life rewards momentum. A lot of people wait too long to change. They spend years overthinking, years doubting themselves, years emotionally negotiating with situations they already know are wrong for them. And during that time, their confidence slowly disappears. That's another thing people don't talk about enough. Staying in the wrong environment for too long damages self-worth. Because deep down, your mind knows when you're settling. You know when you're shrinking yourself. You know when you're betraying your potential. You know when you're living smaller than you're supposed to. And over time, that creates internal frustration. That frustration turns into anxiety, then numbness, then hopelessness. That's why some people lose their energy completely, not because life is impossible, but because they stayed stuck in misaligned situations for too long. You can actually feel this happen in real life. Think about somebody who has wanted to leave a toxic job for years but keeps staying. At first, they're motivated, then frustrated, then emotionally exhausted. Eventually, they stop believing anything better is possible. That's what happens when somebody ignores their inner instinct for too long. And honestly, this is why courage matters so much in life. Not fake motivational courage, real courage, the willingness to risk uncertainty for growth. Because every major life upgrade feels uncomfortable in the beginning. Moving to a new city feels uncomfortable. Starting over feels uncomfortable. Leaving familiar people feels uncomfortable.
Even success itself can feel uncomfortable when you're not used to it. That's why so many people unconsciously sabotage opportunities. Opportunities require transformation, and transformation threatens old identities. A lot of people say they want a better life, but emotionally they still identify with their old limitations. That creates internal conflict. Imagine somebody who grew up around people constantly struggling financially. Even if they suddenly get a big opportunity, part of them may still feel guilty for wanting more. Why? Because their old environment programmed them to fear standing out. That's why changing your life is not just external, it's psychological. You have to become somebody capable of handling a bigger reality. And that process often requires cutting off old patterns. That's where most people hesitate, because humans naturally become attached to identities, even painful ones. Some people become attached to being the loyal one. Some become attached to being the struggling one. Some become attached to being the victim. And even when life offers them a chance to evolve, they unconsciously resist it because growth would force them to abandon the identity they've carried for years. That's deep. And honestly, this is why some people can completely change their life in just a few years, while others stay emotionally frozen forever. The people who evolve understand something important. Nothing changes if nothing changes. Simple. You can't keep repeating the same routines, staying around the same energy, thinking the same thoughts, and expect a completely different future. Life doesn't work like that. Every transformation requires interruption. You interrupt old habits, old thinking, old environments, old emotional attachments. That interruption creates space for growth. And the people who grow the fastest are usually the people least afraid of temporary discomfort. They understand something most people don't. Temporary discomfort is often the price of long-term freedom. That's why highly adaptable people usually go far in life. They don't panic every time life changes. They adjust, they rebuild, they evolve. And honestly, adaptability is becoming more valuable than stability in today's world. The world changes too fast now. Industries change, technology changes, economies change, opportunities change. People who cling too tightly to old ways eventually get left behind. Meanwhile, the people willing to learn, move, pivot, and reinvent themselves keep growing. That's why replacement ability is so powerful. It's the ability to say, this version of my life no longer matches where I'm trying to go, and then actually having the courage to change it. Not next year, not someday, now. Because deep down, successful people understand something average people often avoid. Every decision has a cost. Staying has a cost. Waiting has a cost. Fear has a cost. Comfort has a cost. And sometimes the biggest risk in life is pretending that staying the same is safe. It's not. Because while you're protecting your comfort zone, time is still moving, opportunities are still passing, and your future is still being shaped by the decisions you're too afraid to make today.
Honestly, one of the hardest things to let go of in life isn't a place or a job. It's people. Because people become emotionally tied to our identity, our routines, our memories, our comfort, even our sense of self-worth sometimes. That's why toxic relationships are so dangerous. Not just romantic relationships, friendships too, family dynamics too, even social circles. A bad relationship can quietly drain somebody's energy for years before they fully realize what's happening. And the scary part is, emotional exhaustion usually happens slowly. At first, you ignore it. You make excuses for people. You stay patient. You keep hoping things will improve. But eventually, you notice something strange. You feel heavier after talking to them. Your confidence drops around them. Your motivation disappears around them. Your peace disappears around them. And deep down, you know the relationship is no longer healthy. But you still can't let go. Why? Because attachment is powerful. A lot of people stay connected to relationships that already ended emotionally a long time ago. Not because the connection is healthy, but because they became addicted to familiarity. That's an important difference. Love and attachment are not always the same thing. Real love helps people grow. Attachment often keeps people stuck. Some relationships become emotional prisons. You know the relationship is draining you, but you stay because you invested too much time. You stay because you're afraid of loneliness. You stay because you're emotionally attached to the memories instead of the reality. And honestly, memories are dangerous sometimes, because people often fall in love with who somebody used to be instead of who they are now. That's why some people spend years trying to fix relationships that are already emotionally dead. They keep replaying old moments in their head, how things used to feel, how happy we were before, how different they used to be.
But life doesn't move backward. And one of the most painful lessons in adulthood is realizing that some people are only meant to be temporary chapters in your life, not permanent. That truth is hard for emotionally loyal people to accept, especially people who naturally hold on to connections deeply. Because for them, leaving feels like betrayal, even when staying is destroying them. That's why some people lose themselves completely inside relationships. They slowly abandon their own goals, identity, peace, and confidence just to maintain emotional attachment. And after years of this, they don't even recognize themselves anymore. That happens more than people realize. You can actually watch somebody's energy disappear in the wrong relationship. At first, they're ambitious, curious, alive. Then slowly they become anxious, emotionally tired, insecure, small. And the saddest part? Sometimes they don't even notice it happening because the decline is gradual. That's why protecting your energy matters so much, not in some trendy internet way, in a real psychological way. The people around you directly affect your nervous system, your thinking, your habits, and your emotional state. If somebody constantly brings chaos into your life, eventually your mind starts living in survival mode. And people in survival mode rarely grow. They just react. That's why peaceful environments are so important for success. Growth needs emotional space. You can't build a better future while constantly emotionally recovering from the people around you. And honestly, this is where many people sabotage their own destiny. They keep carrying relationships that no longer align with who they're becoming. Sometimes it's an old friend group that only bonds through negativity. Sometimes it's a partner who secretly resents growth. Sometimes it's people who only support you when you stay small. The moment you evolve, they become uncomfortable. That happens all the time, because not everybody benefits from your growth. Some people only feel comfortable when you remain accessible, predictable, and emotionally dependent on them. The moment you become stronger, more confident, or more independent, the relationship starts changing. And honestly, that change reveals the truth. A healthy relationship celebrates growth. An unhealthy relationship fears it. That's a major difference. And once you realize that, you start seeing people differently. You stop judging relationships by history alone. Because history means nothing if the connection is destroying your future. That's something emotionally intelligent people eventually understand. Time invested does not equal value. Just because you spent years with somebody doesn't mean they deserve permanent access to your life. That idea is difficult for many people, because humans naturally fear endings. Endings make people emotional. But sometimes endings are necessary. A relationship ending doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it means alignment. It means two people no longer belong in the same chapter. And honestly, maturity is realizing that forcing connections can be more damaging than releasing them. Some people are holding on to relationships that block their growth, drain their energy, destroy their confidence, and distract them from their future, all because they're afraid to be alone. But loneliness is temporary. Staying emotionally trapped for years is far worse. And the truth is, once you finally release the wrong people, something surprising happens. You start feeling lighter, clearer, more focused. Your energy returns, your ambition returns, your peace returns. Because deep down, your mind already knew those relationships were costing you too much. You were just emotionally afraid to accept it. That's why one of the most powerful skills in life is learning when to walk away. Not from every difficult situation, but from situations that repeatedly destroy your spirit. Because protecting your future sometimes requires disappointing people. It sometimes requires distance. And sometimes, growth requires you to emotionally detach from the version of yourself that needed those relationships in the first place. That's hard. But honestly, every level of life demands a 10 version of you. And not everybody is meant to come with you to the next level.
At the end of the day, life is really about evolution. The people who grow, succeed, and completely transform their lives are usually not the people who had perfect conditions. They're the people willing to keep updating themselves. That's the real difference. Because life never stays still. Everything changes. Technology changes, cities change, industries change, people change. Even your own personality changes over time. So if somebody refuses to evolve, eventually life starts moving forward without them. And honestly, that's what happens to a lot of people. They get emotionally attached to an old version of life and spend years trying to preserve it. Old routines, old relationships, old beliefs, old environments. Meanwhile, the world keeps changing around them. That's why some people slowly start feeling disconnected from life itself. Not because they're unlucky, but because they stopped growing. You know what's interesting? A lot of people think growth is about adding more things into your life. More money, more success, more opportunities, more connections. But real growth is often about subtraction first. You remove what no longer aligns. That's the part people avoid, because letting go is painful, especially when you invested time, emotion, loyalty, or years of your identity into something. But just because something was once right for you doesn't mean it still is. That's an important lesson in adulthood. Sometimes people outgrow places, outgrow relationships, outgrow mindsets, outgrow entire versions of themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's life. The problem begins when somebody keeps trying to force themselves to stay connected to something they already spiritually outgrew. That creates internal conflict. Part of them wants growth, part of them wants comfort, and eventually they become emotionally stuck between two worlds. That's exhausting, because deep down they already know what needs to change. They're just afraid of what comes after. Honestly, fear of the unknown controls more lives than failure ever will. People stay in unhappy situations because at least the pain feels familiar. But growth has always required uncertainty. Every successful person you admire had moments where they had no guarantees, no certainty, no clear roadmap, no perfect timing. They just made the decision to move forward anyway. That's courage, not the absence of fear, the willingness to move despite fear. And honestly, once you understand this, you start seeing life differently. You stop asking, what if I lose this? And you start asking, what is my life going to look like if I never change? That question changes everything, because staying the same has consequences too. A lot of people treat comfort like safety, but comfort can quietly become a trap, especially when comfort starts replacing growth. Some people become so emotionally attached to stability that they slowly abandon their own potential. They stop challenging themselves, stop exploring, stop evolving, and years later they wake up feeling regret. Not because life was unfair, but because they spent too much time protecting a version of life that no longer matched who they could have become. That's sad, because human beings are designed to evolve. You were never supposed to stay the exact same person forever. Your mindset should evolve, your standards should evolve, your environment should evolve, even your identity should evolve. That's healthy. The people who completely transform their lives usually understand one thing deeply: your future needs space. And sometimes the reason nothing new enters your life is because your hands are still full of things you should have released years ago. Old pain, old fears, old attachments, old relationships, old identities. You can't receive a new life while emotionally clinging to the old one. That's why growth feels lonely in the beginning, because every upgrade creates separation. Separation from old thinking, separation from old environments, separation from people who only understood the old version of you. And honestly, not everybody will understand your evolution. Some people will call you cold, some will say you changed, some will think you became selfish. But growth always looks selfish to people who benefit from your stagnation. Never forget that. At some point, you have to choose. Do you want temporary emotional comfort, or do you want a future that actually fulfills your potential? Because usually, you can't keep both forever. That's the hard truth. And honestly, this is why people who become successful in life often seem different from everybody else around them. It's not just money, it's mindset. They become less emotionally controlled by familiarity, less attached to comfort, less afraid of change. They understand that life rewards movement. The people who adapt survive, the people who evolve grow, and the people who courageously let go eventually create room for something better. That's how transformation happens. Not overnight, but through repeated decisions. The decision to leave environments that shrink you,
the decision to release relationships that drain you, the decision to stop living through fear, the decision to become somebody new. Because at the end of the day, every major life upgrade begins with one painful but necessary skill, the ability to let go. And honestly, the people who refuse to let go usually don't lose because life hates them. They lose because they spent too much time trying to protect what was already supposed to end.